Yesterday, we talked about straight time pay. Today, we're going to talk about overtime pay. So, overtime pay is money earned at an increased rate for working more than the usual number of hours in a week. So typically, let's say you work 40 hours a week and you get straight time pay for that. So that would be 8 hours a day for 5 days a week. That's 40 hours of pay. If you work more than 40 hours, instead of making your usual hourly rate, you may make what's called time and a half or double time. So this is an increased rate. You're getting paid more than your regular hourly rate because you're working overtime. So like I said, one option would be to make time and a half. And that would be a payment to a worker at 1.5 times their usual hourly rate. So let's say, for example, your hourly rate is $10 per hour. All right, to figure out your time and a half, you would take, well, I'll put time and a half. You would take that $10 an hour and multiply it by 1.5, and you would be making $15 an hour as your overtime rate. All right, similarly, you could make double time. So this would be payment to a worker two times their hourly rate. So using that same example, let's say your hourly rate was $10 an hour. Double time, well, that one's a little bit easier, would just be doubling that, and you would be making $20 an hour overtime. Okay, so here's some formulas you're going to need. Again, I like to highlight them so that I can find them a little bit easier in my notes later. So to find your amount of overtime pay, you're going to take your overtime rate, which is either time and a half or double time, and multiply it by the number of hours worked overtime. Now be careful, you're not multiplying it by the total number of hours you worked, you're only multiplying it by the number of hours that you went overtime. Okay? Then to find the total pay or your gross pay, you're going to take whatever your straight time pay was and then add that to your overtime pay. And that's what your total paycheck's going to be. Without taxes or anything taken out yet, we're not talking about that yet. We are just talking about gross pay, which is going to be the amount of money you make before taxes are taken out. All right, so let's try an example of this. So it says Maria is a dental hygienist. her regular hourly rate is $27 per hour. So that's hourly rate. She receives time and a half overtime. This week, she worked 38 hours and 5 hours overtime. So first, we're going to figure out her straight pay. So remember, our straight pay formula was to take the hourly rate and multiply it by the hours worked. So to find her straight time pay, we're going to take $27 and multiply it by the 38 regular time hours that she worked. So go ahead and type that into your calculator, 27 times 38. And Maria's straight time pay is going to be $1,026. All right. Then we have to do her overtime pay. We'll scroll up a little bit so we can see our formula here. So remember, our overtime pay is equal to the overtime rate times the overtime hours worked. Okay, so the first thing I need to figure out is her overtime rate. Well, I am told up here that she receives time and a half for overtime. So I'm going to take the $27 that she makes regular pay and multiply it by 1.5. Because if you recall up here, that's what we said we multiply it by if we're talking about time and a half, 1.5. So 27 times 1.5 is equal to $40.50. This is her overtime hourly rate. All right, so that's how much she makes per hour working overtime. Well, we were told that, I'll grab a different color here, she worked 5 hours overtime. So I'm going to take that $40.50 and multiply it by 5, since that's the number of overtime hours that she worked. So type that in your calculator. And I got that her overtime pay is $202.50. So then the last thing we're asked to do is find her total gross pay. And we do that by taking her straight time pay and adding it to her overtime pay. So $1,026 plus $202.50. So her total gross pay, type it in your calculator, is going to be $1,228.50. All right, so to break this up, first, find the straight time pay. Second, find the overtime pay. And then to find the total pay, you just add those two things together. Okay. All right, you earn $10 per hour. Although you have already worked 40 hours this week, your manager asks you to work 8 hours on Saturday. She will pay you 1.5 times your hourly rate to work on Saturday. Now the question asks, how much money will you earn on Saturday? So to do this, you have to figure out what is the hourly rate going to be on Saturday, and then multiply it by the number of hours you worked on Saturday. So this $10 per hour, remember that's your straight time hourly rate. To find your overtime hourly rate, I need to multiply that by 1.5. So my overtime rate is $15. So now to figure out how much she worked on or you earned on Saturday, we only take the hours that you worked on Saturday to consider in your overtime. So you're going to take the $15, that's your overtime rate, and multiply it by the 8 hours of overtime that you worked. So for just working on Saturday, you made $120. All right, and that question was a little bit tricky because it didn't ask you your total pay, so you didn't really have to worry about these 40 hours. We weren't asked anything about that. The only question asked was, well, how many hours did you work on, or how much money did you make on Saturday? All right, so be careful. Read these questions carefully. All right. Barb installs installation. She is paid $9 per hour for an 8-hour day and time and a half for overtime for any hours worked over 8 hours per day. So this one's a little bit tricky because instead of paying like overtime based on how many hours that you work per week, this job is saying any day that you work more than 8 hours, you get overtime for that day for anything over 8 hours. Okay? So then we are asked to find the pay for a week when she worked 7, 11, 8, 10, and 9 hours. Okay, so let's set this up. Let's see, day 1, she worked 7 hours. Okay, that means she made $9.50 per hour for that day with no overtime. Okay, so I'm going to say day 1, she worked 7 hours and she made $9.50 per hour. So on day 1, she made $66.50. All right, no overtime there. Day 2, a little bit different. She worked 11 hours. So she worked 8 hours straight time and 3 hours overtime. All right, so here we're going to have 8 times $9.50 because that's our straight time pay. So she made $76. All right, but for our 3 hours overtime, we have to use time and a half. So let's figure out what our overtime pay is going to be. And remember, time and a half, we multiply our straight pay by 1.5. So our overtime hourly rate is going to be $14.25. So these 3 hours that she worked overtime, we're going to multiply by $14.25, which gives her $42.75. All right, let's look at day 3. She worked 10 hours. So that would be 8 hours straight time and 2 hours overtime. So I'm going to take 8 times $9.50 again, which will give me the same thing, $76. And then we're going to take our 2 hours overtime and multiply it by that overtime rate, which is $14.25. and that would be $28.50. All right, day 4. She worked 8 hours. So no overtime that day. That would just be 8 times $9.50, which is still $76. And then day 5, she worked 9 hours. So that's going to be 8 hours regular pay. And then she had 1 hour overtime. So that's going to be 1 times $14.25, which is $14.25. So to find her total pay, we're going to take all of these values, all of her straight pay and her overtime pay, and add them all together. So grab your calculator, and we're going to do 6650 plus 76 plus 4275 plus 76 plus 2850 plus 76 plus 76 plus that last 1425. So her total pay is going to be $456. All right, another way you could have done this is just figured out the total number of straight pay hours and the total number of overtime hours, and then multiplied those two numbers together and then added them all up. Okay, but this way works as well. More than one way to do things always. All right. I'm going to give you an opportunity to work this one out on your own in some pieces here. So it says Cindy is paid $8.35 per hour and time and a half for any hours worked over 40 hours per week. So this is back to overtime being total numbers per week. If you go over the 40 hours per week, then you get the overtime. So it says find her total hours and gross pay for a week in which she worked 8.5, 7, 4.5, 9, 7.5, and 6 hours. So first thing you need to do is calculate the total number of hours that Cindy worked this week. So go ahead and give that a try. So by adding all of those together, you should have gotten that Cindy worked a total of 42.5 hours. All right, so now figure out her straight time pay. And remember, straight time pay is 40 hours. So you should have gotten that Cindy's straight time pay was $334 for working 40 hours. Now, she did work over 40 hours, right? We said that she worked 42.5 hours. So she worked 2.5 hours overtime. And remember in the problem, it said for overtime, we get time and a half. So figure out your overtime rate and then multiply it by the number of hours that she worked overtime. You should have gotten $31.33. Now, in your calculator, you might have had 31.325, but remember money is always 2 decimal points, okay? So that's why that was rounded up to $31.33. All right, now last question is, what is her total gross pay? So go ahead and solve for that one. All right, you should have gotten that her total gross pay was $365.33. And we got that by adding together her straight time pay and her overtime pay.